Hi everyone, my name is Corey. I'm Jom's arts editor. Really thrilled to see all of you here at Jomfest today. It's my great honor to introduce the next panel on the arts, subtitled Freedom and Survival. But before we start, just a few quick notes. We will have a Mentimeter. Maybe you could flash the slide. So you can go to menti.com and use the code 26128723 if you have like a short comment or a question. But we will also have a roving mic later on in case any of you want to ask a question in person, and Sudhir, our editor-in-chief, will get it to you. And also the panel discussion itself will be recorded on the record. We'll probably try to do something with it probably on YouTube or put it a kind of summary on our website. But the Q&A will be completely off the record, so you can feel free to ask whatever you want of the panelists. It is my great honor to introduce the moderator for today's panel, Aditi, who's sitting at the far right. Aditi is one of our, I think, longest running arts contributors that's quite a few to Jo. She's written about everything from migration to menstruation. And also, I think our paths have crossed so many times in the arts, whether that's bumping into each other in galleries like Objectives, writing for similar publications like Arts Equator. And I think she has such a sensitivity and a thoughtful eye that I'm sure she will bring to this panel as well. So thank you so much, Aditi, and I'll leave you to introduce the rest of the panelists.
Hello. Okay. Can I be heard at the back? Okay, thank you. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and to Jom for organizing this and having us. So today we're gathered with, I'll just go down the line. We have Usha Chandradas, co-founder of Plural Art Mag, XUE from Singapore Butoh Collective, the co-founder, as well as Mok Cui Yin, the producer and head of Biennale Singapore Art Museum. Okay, I didn't actually go in the order. So today we're going to discuss freedom, survival, sustainability, and engaging with critique, and we'll see what else we can cover in an hour. And of course, you know, across our disciplines, it may not cover like each and every aspect of the arts out there, but hopefully there'll be some experiences and thoughts that might resonate, and then we can have a bit of a conversation during maybe the last 15 minutes of the hour for Q&A. So you can send in your questions through the Mentimeter, or we can pass the mic around as well. So right, let's get started. So maybe to start with, could each of you, introduce yourself briefly and share your practice, as well as where you see it positioned within Singapore's arts ecosystem. So maybe we can go down the line.
Okay, hi everybody. Can you hear me? My name is Usha Chandradas, so I do a bunch of different jobs, just like most creatives in Singapore. I'm a lawyer by training, so I spend 2 days a week working at a law firm. My area of specialization is in tax. I do some teaching at NTU. I run their international tax and trade law program for their undergraduates. And then I also run an art magazine. We're called Plural Art Mag, and we have a specific focus on Southeast Asian modern and contemporary visual art. So I suppose where I see myself in the arts ecosystem is really being in a place where I'm trying to grow the community for art writers to be able to express what they see and what they feel about art shows. I think it's important that we develop this kind of discourse in Singapore, because that's the way that artists and producers can grow and develop, right? If nobody is seeing your work and talking about it or writing about it, then how do you get feedback on the kind of work that you're doing and whether it's receiving the kind of reception that you want it to receive? And at the same time, writers need platforms as well to grow their skills, and I hope that Plural Art Mag is able to contribute to that space. In the last Parliament of Singapore, I also served as the nominated Member of Parliament representing arts issues and the arts community. So that's really just a very brief introduction of where I sit in the arts ecosystem.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. You can hear me at the back. Just keep up the tradition. So, hi, I'm XUE. I'm a producer and I'm a community organizer. I've been working in the arts or producing for about 17 to 18 years now. And I was an independent producer for most of it, working across disciplines from performing, literary arts to visual arts, but also architecture, design, etc. Everything except film and TV, which maybe in the future, I don't know. But as a community organizer, I'm also part of the organizing or planning team of 2 producers community networks, which are also communities of practice, which is Producers SG, SG for Singapore, and the Asian Producers Platform. And across, my work as a community organizer as well as a producer, fundamentally it's about thinking and considering and facilitating the conditions of production and encounter and experience of the arts in Singapore. And more recently, in the last year and a half, I had my first foray into employment, and I joined the Singapore Art Museum. My first job. My parents are surprised. So I joined the Singapore Art Museum to take on the role as head of the Singapore Biennale, which is basically to lead the team, the very small team that plans, produces, and delivers the Singapore Biennale.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is XUE. I am the founder of the Singapore Butoh Collective. So for those who don't know, butoh is an avant-garde movement or dance form that originated from Japan. And you might know it from the dancers' bodies being painted white and generally looking quite scary. So a lot of the work that I do around my collective is really about demystifying some of the preconceptions around this art form. So just to backtrack a little bit, I am a butoh dancer, I am a performance artist, and for my rice bowl, I also work as a graphic designer, freelance, and I teach graphic design at LaSalle. Yeah, so prior to moving back to Singapore and starting my work with the collective, I lived in New York City for 7 years and came back right at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And somehow I think that period of coming back and having to reconcile certain aspects of Singapore through a kind of like forced home quarantine really helped me to like reevaluate some of my relationship to the country and also my parents whom I was living with. Anyway, aside from that, as an artist who now has a good relationship with their parents and is running a community, I think that through this work, I have been able to renegotiate some of my relationship to the state and how it means to live and work here in an authentic way. And my collective is committed to, or I am committed to the work of my collective to building more infrastructure around the art form of butoh in Singapore. Not just butoh for butoh's sake, but also in thinking about how to expand and give more freedom to the younger generation to think a lot about how art can exist in outside of the institution and also in more transdisciplinary ways. So yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. So I think we've already, this word kind of freedom has come up and maybe we can start there. So as Jom contextualized the panel, as they publicized it, they mentioned that in Singapore, the government is the biggest employer and funder of the arts. And we have a bit of a precarious balance between artistic independence and institutional reliance. So to start with, maybe I'll start with XUE. So, you're a really experienced producer who's worked across different disciplines and mediums, like different scales. So, what does freedom, whether it's like creative or otherwise, look like to you when you're working to make good art happen, which I think is this like really cool phrase that I first learned off from you.
Yeah, that phrase actually, usually in my bio, I use the phrase to make good art happen better. So that it's also not just about the outcome of the art, but the process of getting there, and of everyone who is involved in the picture, not just of the artists whose voices want to be heard, but also all the arts workers and very often volunteers, etc. I think freedom is obviously a very loaded word for us to consider, but if we want to zoom out a little bit, we can think about freedom from, freedom to, and freedom of. I think freedom of expression, let me just put it out there clearly, is something that is something we face challenges on across all segments of expression, but it's also something that allows different types of constraints and conditions for us to negotiate with. When it comes to freedom from and freedom to maybe carry on from what was brought up in the keynote earlier today, it's, to me, really, it's about agency and affordance. At the end of the day, a lot of the people who work in the arts do it because we love it and we want to. So for me, it's as a producer working independently or now from within an institution, how do I let this love not be taken for granted is something really important. So it's not just about doing something for its sake or pushing walls for its sake, but also knowing that there is conversations that can be had about the conditions, whether it's me negotiating the contractual terms, the budget for a commission, for example, or discussing the ethos of the rehearsal room, and the basis of which everyone is gathered and invited to be part of a work. And actually the freedom and the agency here is in the option to say no and the ability to make informed decisions. So of course I could go on about how there is a lot of inequality in terms of entry points, backgrounds. Not everyone can afford to say no to an unfair contract. Not everyone can afford to walk away from what might be an ethically compromised room. And also not everyone can necessarily make what seems to be the most simple decision when it comes to negotiating the terms in which their work is presented. So really working with the artist, my responsibility and what I think is important to have ahead and amongst ourselves is to know that the artist trusts me and we have a kind of trusting relationship, to know that we all have each other's best interests at heart as much as that of the work. And we all actually have the freedom to walk away and or to negotiate the specific terms that we live with. Yeah.
Thank you. And for XUE, you had shared previously that you're actively involved in Singapore's DIY and independent communities, and then, of course, you also, are in projects that are supported by institutions like SCAPE. So, could you share a bit about your experience traversing these two contexts, whether it's like similarities or differences?
So, I think with regards to walking across both underground and institutional contexts, I think a lot of the work that I do in the Singapore Underground is really inspired by the DIY culture that I experienced in New York City, whereby I used to have a Singaporean roommate that I lived with who asked me, would you like to be a big fish in a small pond or a small fish in a big pond? And I had no idea really what that meant. But I think being like so-called a big fish in a small pond, or like someone who's trying to do work within the context of Singapore. In the small pond, when you throw a rock, you can see the ripples faster and more immediate as well. And I feel like that's something that draws me to do the work that I do here. So as someone who is a butoh dancer who has a performing arts practice that grew out of this underground DIY culture, part of what I do in Singapore is I also organize underground or experimental events that feature butoh activities and so forth. And on an institutional playing field, I am a performance artist supported by Dance Nucleus as an associate artist, and my collective now is also a supported resident interest group at SCAPE. So we have support from MCCY to conduct our activities. So I think what helps with straddling these two spheres is, one, I am pretty eloquent, I think. So if I need to talk about something within an institutional context, I think I can get my point across to a relatively okay degree. If not, you can talk to me later. And I think within the underground context, I'm an artist. Yeah, we're crazy. Yeah, that's it.
Thank
Did I
you.
answer that?
Yeah, definitely. Lots of food for thought. So, Usha, for yourself, you've moved across, law, policy, writing, arts work, and I reckon there's even much more. Have there been any through lines in your experience of freedom across these spheres?
Yeah, I thought this was a very poetic question. Took me a while to think about it. And thank you, Trey and Shrev, for sharing. I think I really resonate with a lot of the things that you said. But maybe I'll take a different perspective on it. And I think for me, personally, and I'll share my personal experience, and I'll share a little bit about the things that I hear from people, right? Talking to people in the course of my work. For me personally, the biggest amount of freedom that I found in the creative work that I do with my art magazine is financial freedom, right? So I have other jobs that pay me good money to do other things. And that actually gives me the room and the space to be able to do the work with my magazine that I want to do, right? To your point about being able to say no and choosing things. And, it sounds very crass to say, right, that we need to be able to feed ourselves and look after ourselves financially, but I really see this as something that a lot of younger arts workers, especially students, and I speak to a lot of students, definitely when I was carrying out my NMP duties, I spoke to a lot of students in schools, and that was one question that kept coming up over and over again, right? The two standard questions were, my parents are worried if I become a full-time artist, please tell me what I can say to them so that they will be less scared, and what do I do? How can I earn a living in Singapore? It's very, very expensive. Do you have any suggestions? Even with arts educators sometimes, and this was one of the saddest bits of feedback I think that I ever got, and that was that, when they have students who come to them to ask about their prospects in the arts, sometimes arts educators themselves feel a little bit irresponsible if they encourage their students to pursue a full-time career in the arts without thinking of the financials when they consider what the student's background is. And so for the educators themselves, it's really quite terrible, right? You spend your life educating students in the arts, and then when it comes down to giving them advice on what kind of career they can have, you actually hand to heart maybe cannot tell them to make a decision that might be irresponsible depending on their financial circumstances. So a lot of the things that I heard, when I was doing my NMP work, or even just in the course of being an arts writer and being out in the community, is that money is, a big issue, and financial sustainability is a big issue. So a lot of the things that I talked about in Parliament actually related to that. And for me personally, yes, I mean, if I have other sources of funding for my magazine, it means I don't have to rely on government grants. Sure, the government is a client. The government is a client of many arts workers. My magazine doesn't qualify for any grants because we're not a non-profit, or as I like to tell people, we're not a non-profit by choice. We're structured as a for-profit entity, but as we all know, publishing businesses are not the easiest to run. But yeah, that's really where freedom has come to me in my experience.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think what you've already touched on also segues quite nicely into something else we wanted to talk about, which is sustainability and survival. So, of course, there's the work of art making, but there's also these questions of sustainability and survival, both as workers and practitioners, and then also the sustainability of the different art forms, the collectives and institutions, and the spaces as well. So, sorry, I won't be giving you a break. I think because you had already talked a little bit about salaries and working conditions, and we had chatted previously about how, as an arts NMP from 2023 to 25, this was one of the things that you had advocated quite actively for. Are there any other challenges to sustainability that you might want to add to this conversation?
Yeah, I think the point about salary guidelines was something that I pushed a little bit because that's what I was hearing from people on the ground, right? And Trey, to your point about working practices that are not ideal, one common source of anxiety is that, you don't know what to charge as an arts freelancer, right? If lots of us that work in the arts do it on a freelance basis, if we have jobs, then great, but not all of us operate on that basis. You don't know what to charge, you don't know what kinds of conditions you should be expecting, you don't know whether you're underselling yourself, and it's a real source of anxiety. So salary guidelines was something that I wanted to push a little bit. The government's response to that was, no, you're looking at it in the wrong way, right? Salary guidelines, yeah, okay, they serve a purpose, but really what we should be doing is growing the pie for all arts workers. So creating opportunities for arts workers to find good jobs. You may or may not achieve that with salary guidelines, and I think that's a fair point. The other thing about salary guidelines also is that not everybody in the arts community has the same view on it, right? So, and I'll share with you a selection of the views that I got, right? Some people would say, well, salary guidelines only benefit the workers that are not so good. If we are very experienced and we can command a very high fee, why should this salary guideline actually stop us from charging the rates that we deserve, right? And then, of course, the other side of that argument is that, well, if it's better working conditions for everybody, then everyone benefits together, and we shouldn't be thinking about it in really such a selfish way, right? So different viewpoints. I think when we think about sustainability in the arts, there's the demand side and then there's the supply side, right? So people must want what you are producing if you want them to pay something for the things that you produce. So that's the demand side. On the supply side, we need to make sure, and I agree with you fully, Trey, that we need to make sure that our arts workers are, I won't say happy because nobody is really happy all the time, right? They find content and they are content and they find meaning in their work. I think that's a good enough ask. Me as an arts worker, that's what I would want for myself. So demand side and supply side. On the demand side, interesting things are happening, right? We have the culture pass that's available to everyone now. And I think that's clever because it really, looks at Singaporean kiasuism, right? You give Singaporeans money, they will not want to waste it, so they will find ways to spend it. And maybe if that forces people to experience an arts event that they would not ordinarily have experienced, then I think that's a good thing. On the supply side, to your point, Trey, about being more empowered to say no, I think the realities of imbalances are just what they are, right? Sometimes you cannot afford to say no to a job just because you need it. Even if the working conditions are really bad, maybe you have no choice, you just take it, right? But I think what helps is if you know what your rights are and you know what you are actually agreeing to, what you could have said no to, and really what the landscape is in terms of your legal rights. And there, I think there are a couple of interesting initiatives that are coming up. The Pro Bono Office is doing something with the National Arts Council and the Arts Resource Hub, and I'm personally involved with that project, so I know a little bit about it. We are trying to get lawyers to offer more pro bono support to arts freelancers, and hopefully that will go some way towards educating people as to what their rights are. And the other interesting thing I think that the government announced during this year's budget is a creative entrepreneurship program to teach arts businesses how to develop more sustainable practices. I don't think a lot of details have been announced about that program yet, but it sounds to me to be quite hopeful. So that's something that I'm looking forward to hearing more about.
Great, thank you. I think maybe moving on to Xue. So, you're both an artist and you're a founder and organizer of the Singapore Butoh Collective. So, how do you negotiate and balance, these two roles? And maybe, how does sustainability of the art form and its longevity in Singapore figure into your considerations?
Thank you. This was the question I was quite excited about, actually, and I might start rambling. So, but really, I think the common sort of gripe about the Singapore arts ecosystem or like difficulty for artists in the arts is money, funding, location, audience, so on and so forth. But I really think it's asymptomatic of a larger problem. And as an artist and someone who's also active in building or developing that infrastructure, in particular for my Butoh Collective, which is a niche art form that has just emerged in Singapore with a resurgence like due to our activities, I feel like on one hand I can bear the brunt of some of the kind of like growing pains of actually working as an artist on the ground within this ecosystem itself, and also being part of like the people who are trying to build more systems for artists to inhabit. So for me, really, the sustainability issue is not actually just about money, but really it's about a lack of communication between departments, whether it's grassroots or on like an upper management level. And also, artists and art is not some genre-based thing where you can be like, this is painting, this is performance, this is whatever. I don't think that artists necessarily work in a linear, rational, or logical way. Sometimes I get my ideas in the shower, and sometimes I get them on the bus, and therefore, this lack of understanding or flexibility, because Singapore works, I think, across a more like blanket policy, pattern tracking kind of system, doesn't really allow for like the individualized experience of the artist, whereby these things are tailored towards the artist to give them more autonomy in how they might like to feel out the work. And I use the word growing pains as well. Like, we need to let the artists make mistakes, but the money only comes to the artists that don't make mistakes. And therefore, what you have to give in Singapore is the answer and not the idea. And I really disagree with that. Yeah. And that's going to make it unsustainable because there's no room for growth. Yeah, there's no room for dialogue. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really given me a lot to think about, the way you phrased it as well. I do agree, it's true.
Yeah, I think about it a lot.
Maybe the conversations can continue from this as well. So I think also, we are focused on Singapore today, but of course we cannot, or perhaps should not, be ignoring Singapore's role in a wider regional, international arts ecosystem. So on that note, Chue, as you've been quite involved for several years in regional and international platforms, like Producers SG, which is maybe more local, as well as the Asian Producers Platform, could you share a bit more about how these contribute to this idea of sustainability and survival as well, if they do?
I guess, like, building on what's already been spoken about so far, thinking about legal, financial, and policy infrastructures, as well as the threads of communication and literacy that are necessary to have things flow. At the heart of the arts is the people. And to me, a network, any kind of network, is just a bunch of people trying to hold on together. And the communities of, speaking about Producers SG, for example, one of the taglines that we put on our website is that being indie doesn't have to be lonely. And I think trying to find ways to remind ourselves that we're not alone, we're in this together. There are things to be gained from sharing information, sharing resources, redistributing our funds and knowledge amongst ourselves, and finding ways to connect each other across contexts and boundaries in perhaps a world or ecosystem that sometimes tries to place particular lines between us, whether it's national, art form specific, or any other kinds of lines. So I think when it's about sustainability, of course, all of these things that have been spoken about are fundamental and necessary to have all at the same time. But a lot of these international platforms and gatherings that I'm involved in are really about bringing people together in a room, us being sweaty and walking the ground and enjoying and reflecting and crying, honestly, a lot of the time, and then dreaming together. And so I think about all of these things as rehearsals as well. We are rehearsing being together. We are rehearsing ways of doing and ways of relating and ways of producing and ways of making art that sometimes defy the other types of messages we get from the broader economy, ecology, or political systems that we try to kind of keep afloat in. But I think these types of networks and spaces are also spaces for us to rehearse disagreement, and how we fight and how we learn to fight better are also really important types of resources that serve us best in moments of crisis. And I think this really came through very visibly and tangibly for a lot of us during the pandemic, when these networks that we just thought, you know, they're like annual gatherings or weekly, monthly gatherings, they then become the social and human safety net for each other, to just try to pedal towards the next step. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this segment especially has been, you know, so rich and so well expressed that I'll be thinking about these things for a long time to come. So I picked up on the word fighting, if I may apply it to a slightly different context. You know, one other segment of discussion that came up as we were developing the panel with Jom was not just discussing arts and culture, but also critique and how a culture of critique plays into developing or like supporting the arts ecosystem. So maybe let's just talk a bit about that before we get on to the Q&A. So yeah, I'm curious how each of you encounters and engages with critique. And to start with, maybe Usha, you could share a little about how Plural Art Mag approaches critique within the full scope of its work. So, you know, you'll do like reviews, events coverage, interviews, and then I guess critique is like part of that.
Yes, it is. This is actually the topic that I get the most criticism for when I talk about my art magazine in different contexts. Because at Plural, so Plural's been around, this will be our 10th year, right? 10th year, we're purely online because we have no budget for print. Maybe one day we will get there. Maybe this year, I don't know if there's any generous sponsors in the audience. Maybe if my law practice does well at the end of the year, we'll see. But one of the things that we're often criticized for is that we are not harsh enough in our criticism of art shows and art reviews. So we do exhibition reviews, and the feedback, every talk that I give about the magazine, there'll at least be one or two people which say, hey, you know, we like what you do, but you need to be a little bit harder when you're giving your criticism. As a magazine, our policy is that if you have absolutely nothing good to say about a show, you hated every single thing about it, and there is no way that you can suggest to make it better, we will decline to review. Okay, so I know that that's not journalistically the highest kind of standard that you can have, or the best kind of standard, but it's a considered decision. And I'm happy to take any kind of criticism that my writers have, but my one ask of them is to please say how you would have done it differently. Okay, it may not necessarily be better. What is better is up to someone else, you know, to decide. Everyone will have different views. Fine, but I would like to see some suggestion for constructive improvement, right? And if you can't give me that, then I don't want to publish something that trashes a show from start to finish and to no end. So the comment that I get when I say that is that, well, you know, any criticism is good criticism, and for people to be able to grow, they need to be able to take, you know, the harsh kind of scolding that a really good art critic will give them. And I think, yeah, okay, that these are all valid points, but that's not what I want my magazine to be about, right? You know, to Trey's point about having community and having networks, anybody who has worked with artists, and we have worked with artists too in the projects that we do, anybody who has worked with artists will know that no one ever sets out to do a bad work, right? Everybody puts their heart and soul into it, they try their best, and they try to do something that, you know, sparks some kind of thought or emotion or reaction in the audience. So when you've had that experience working with artists on that level, I really don't think it is a very fair thing for you to do, to just criticize, you know, from start to finish with no suggestion for improvement at all. So that's how we approach critique. And I know not everybody agrees with it, but I think that's okay. There's room for lots of different kinds of publications. Generally, you know, we don't take down stories or things like that. We sort of let things stand. We have published things where people will write in and say, hey, I don't agree with what this artist has done, or based on, you know, what somebody else has told me, this is a problematic person. We don't respond to things like that if they're based on rumors or hearsay. There was one instance where we took a story down. So this was an incident where we had an artist that was actually threatening us with defamation suits. There was nothing, from a legal perspective, there was nothing defamatory about the article, right? But we were getting many emails, notes from this artist. And it got to the point where it was getting a little bit threatening. And to be honest, we were quite scared for the writer. You know, I mean, I can defend myself, you know, my co-founder Pauline, who was working with us at the time, she's perfectly capable of defending herself too. But the writer that was involved in this was quite young, and we thought it got to a stage where we were a little bit worried about their safety. And that's just maybe one instance in 10 years where we've taken down a story. It's still in our archives, it's just not published on our website. So I suppose to summarize, we try to take a balanced view of critique as best we can, and also with a view to what the Singapore art scene is like. I think we're a small community. We're still in a position where we're trying to expand audiences. We're trying to get people to go out to shows and see them and see what great art our artists make. So, if we're trashing shows from start to finish, people just aren't going to go. And I don't think that is a good thing to have in the art scene. So that's how we approach it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think on that note, so, in the recently concluded Singapore Biennale, there was a lot of robust discussion that was coming from like different sorts of spaces or parties. So, the Biennale being a Biennale that, I quote, envisions art in everyday Singaporean life. Chue, I was wondering if you can maybe speak a bit from your experience on how, the Biennale would receive and balance critique from these different perspectives, ranging from like policy shapers to arts professionals to the general public and more.
So I get asked this question a lot, and then I always think about my history teacher in JC, shout out Mr. Thompson. I hope you're enjoying retirement. And when we were learning about the French Revolution and about multiple versions of history, Mr. Thompson said there are as many versions of the French Revolution as people who experienced it. I'm not saying the Biennale is revolutionary, just to be clear. But I think that there will be as many versions, experiences, and opinions about something like the Singapore Biennale that was, especially for this edition, placing so many works in public spaces. So for those of you who are less familiar with what we did, we had artworks in outdoor spaces along the rail corridor. We had works in apartment blocks in Wessex Estate, in shop houses in Tanglin Halt, and of course we also had works in gallery spaces and museum spaces, but also, say, for example, Lucky Plaza and Far East Shopping Centre. So everyone, from my perspective, is, whether it's the uncle that runs the hardware store next to the shop unit that I'm renting, to the resident that passes by that specific shop unit in Tanglin Halt on the way to the market after church service on Sundays, only on Sundays, down, and of course the arts workers, the volunteers, the government stakeholders, the landlords, etc., and definitely every other kind of like members of the public that cross our paths as audiences. All of their views are really important to me. And I think it is a lesson for myself in learning how to balance all of these views, because they will always be coming from somewhere. There will always be different expectations that are carried with them. Sometimes there's no expectation as well. And I think for the robust discussion that you are kind of referring to, there was also a lot of, not a lot, there was like fairly public criticism of the Biennale and some fronts of the Biennale as well. As much as there was also private people texting us, emailing us, etc. So I think really as a person that really wants something to be generative, my first duty is to listen. And any and every message that comes my way into the inbox, complaining about something or saying that they love something, I take it upon myself with my team to respond to every single one of them. Whether, even if it's to thank them, sometimes to explain, sometimes to offer them something else. And I think when it comes to the more public type of arts writing and critique, I think what I would love is even more discussion, actually. I do miss perhaps the spaces that we used to have where there was a lot more back and forth. If anyone remembers the Yahoo group era where people, after watching a theatre production or visiting an exhibition, will be dropping a message, did you see this? And then they'll write about how much they liked it. And then people will, with their names on them, be very comfortable to disagree. And very often these are also conversations that take place in the third spaces, but in the interstices, on the curbside, over prata, etc., etc. So I think I would have loved to have more conversations, in fact. And I think that perhaps even with the Biennale having ended in late March, the conversation doesn't end there because there's a lot more that we can pick up on. But I take comfort also in the people who came up to us and shared their private thoughts with us, or in the small moments, like there was one resident that walked into one of our venues one day. It's like, what is this noise? Like, why? Very like, you know. And then my colleague was like, oh, hello, uncle. This is, you know, we're doing the Singapore Biennale, and then brought him on a little tour, and you know, look at this painting. It's and then he went home, and then he brought his grandkids back after. So I think it's not just about the critique, but the engagement that the critique allows us to have. I think those are really important things to hold on to whenever we can. Yeah.
Thank you. And I guess as a final question to sort of wrap up this segment, you know, critique can of course also flow from the practitioners, the administrators, kind of upwards or outwards towards the institutional figures and administrators. So Shui, could you share a little bit about maybe how you've encountered this and what your experience has been?
Encountered critique. Actually, surprisingly, despite the experimental nature of the butoh activities in Singapore, we haven't gotten much critique in terms of the work itself. People are really delighted to see what we're doing, and in Singapore there actually, I believe, is an appetite for like more types of experimental art and boundary pushing forms that you know, don't really fit into the box of whether you can critique it or not. Yeah, and I kind of get really excited about that. However, maybe things that we might have been critiqued for is not being professional enough, or not like understanding like liability issues when working with institution. For example, like in the underground, if you want to do something, you just build it, and then it gets done, and then it happens. Within the institution, you build something, you got to go through like 5 layers of paperwork. Then you got to check that it's not more than X amount of meters high and blah, blah, blah. And then we get critiqued for not knowing about it. And I believe that's something that's a little bit problematic because there is no like support system for educating young artists on how to navigate the institution when the institution wants to capitalize on your cultural capital. And after that, they think that you're difficult to work with. And once they've milked that out of you, they don't want to work with you anymore. So I guess instead of the critique being leveraged at us, I'm leveraging it back. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think that's it from me. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much to all three panelists and all of you.